Hello and welcome back to Take Charge of Your Health and to episode 4 of Living Loving Relationships program with health psychologist Jenifer Skues. In our last session, we discussed our defenses and others' defenses as well, how to identify them and work with them, and how to be Christ-like in pointing out others' defenses. We also talked about how early relationships affect our future ones, and Jenifer gave some very practical and biblical tips about how to restore the balance in those relationships. And if you haven't watched our previous sessions on this topic, please do so, as today's session ties in with the previous ones. Today, we're talking about boundaries, how to have healthy boundaries and respect others' boundaries as well. Just a quick reminder to everyone that you can send in your questions based on these sessions, and depending on the amount of questions we receive, we will have a separate Q&A segment to answer just those questions. If this topic interests you, make sure you check out our other presentations with Jenifer on mental health. Most of them have been recorded live and can be found in our live section on our YouTube channel. Jenifer, great to have you back on the program. Session 4 already, and we've learned a lot from our last sessions with you. I'm looking forward to this session especially, though, because it is important to set healthy boundaries. And I guess we're going to find out how boundaries are not walls and they actually are healthy, right?
Well, this is the key to having healthy, happy relationships, because if we don't know how to set appropriate boundaries, that's when we actually say and do things that hurt other people and can eventually do permanent damage in some relationships. So how we respect and talk to each other and set limits is vital in having success in our relationships.
Absolutely. And I have a lot more questions for you. And let's start with a word of prayer and get right into them. Okay, dear Lord, we thank you so much again for yet another opportunity to come together and discuss mental health. We do want to know how to set healthy boundaries, how not to offend anyone, how to protect others and ourselves as well. Please be with our guest speaker, Jenifer Skues, and be with us as well, that we can have open hearts and minds to accept what you have for us. We thank you and we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you. So to start with, to set the foundation, Jenifer, what are boundaries? Obviously, we hear about them quite a bit, but what are they really?
Well, if you think of the boundaries around a house, we have a fence. Okay, if you don't have a fence, people can just walk all over the place, come in, trample on the garden, animals come in and dig it up, do all sorts of things. So to protect ourselves, it's the same thing. We need to look at having a fence and a gate of some sort to be able to protect ourselves and be able to let the right people into our life and know how to maintain that boundary. For example, if you're a healthy person, you'll have a fence, but you'll have a gate, but you'll know when to open the gate, when to lock it, when to close it. Whereas if you really have a lot of pain in your life and not happy in relationships, you're likely to lock the gate and not let anyone in that door. Or if you have inappropriate boundaries, which some people do because of their upbringing and family and their need to be loved and to be loved. And then you might leave the gate open and let too many different people in your life that isn't healthy and isn't satisfying. So we can either not have a boundary or a fence or a limit on ourselves, or we can go to the excess of being too rigid and fixed. So how we set boundaries and the type of boundaries we need varies incredibly, because we meet so many different types of people and in different settings, whether you're at home with your children, your family, husband and wife, or any sort of relationship, friendship, work relationships, have different types of boundaries depending on what we need. So it's not there's a similar way to set boundaries. We can have a formula, which we're going to look at, but how we do it in different relationships varies, because that what is needed varies in keeping our distance or letting people in that door.
And that's a really good illustration, isn't it? Gate is not a bad thing in itself, but we just need to know when to open it, when to close it, and what's the point of a gate if you're going to let everyone in.
Absolutely. And so this is where we leave it open, So this is where we learn to put our boundary up, and when to open that door or when to close the door, or what's appropriate depending on the people we're dealing with and the type of relationship.
And as we said, we will discuss more and we'll go more in depth in it. But as we said, boundaries are not walls, so they're not such a bad thing. And we also discussed in our last session that the way we treat each other can either build or destroy our relationships. Can you elaborate on this further?
Well, how we build a relationship is to do with skills. We're not born to have those skills. I mean, you look at a baby. What does a baby have to be able to relate? They learn to survive. They've got an emotional content, but they can't talk. So they have to learn a lot of skills. So it's not all just programmed in where you have that program and then you're a certain age and the program kicks in and we know how to have healthy boundaries. So we bring personality and skills with us when we're born, but how we learn and develop and grow in boundaries is so relevant to our family, our social situation, and particularly your relationship with your primary caregiver, which is usually the mother. And we have talked about that before in previous sessions we've done, because you have to have a good, healthy, bonded relationship by the age of 2, where that caregiver helps you to regulate yourself and teaches you about boundaries. If you have a family that doesn't have good boundaries, what are you going to learn? It's and then if your boundaries are violated, even as you're growing up, you go to school to try and develop friendships. This is where boundaries are just so varied, depending on who we are and what we've learned. But you can always build healthier boundaries. When we don't have good skills and we're hurting, we're going to be more destructive towards people. So we're going to use boundaries inappropriately. But when we are working healthily, we are going to learn skills, and that's what this is about. I mean, we're not born to know all the communication skills. We learn those skills, and often we learn inappropriate skills, like a family where everyone talks all over everyone else and nobody's listening is not healthy communication or setting healthy boundaries. So, but you can learn to do that. And this is where people need to learn to have a healthy, happy relationship that is alive and well. We have to learn how to do this. And you haven't failed if you haven't learned it, because what you've learned are the mistakes that we were brought up with. And I've done the same thing. But then now we've got some wonderful resources with books, even on video platforms. There are many things we can do to learn and grow. We can get help. But I just want people to realise it's not innate in us to be able to set healthy boundaries. If anything, we've learnt the wrong way, not the right way. So this is a challenge.
That is very true. And I just remember a friend that once I did mention to her that she cuts me off and all of that. And she said, well, that's how I'm used to talking, because she said, if at home, if you don't talk quick enough, then someone is going to jump in and you would have missed your spot. So you do have to do that.
Yes, yeah. So it doesn't build relationships. If anything, it can destroy them over time, but it doesn't give fulfillment because you can't connect. Because boundaries are about connecting with each other. How can I healthily connect with someone so I don't violate their space, I make it comfortable for them, that I learn how to set those boundaries or limits so they know where the relationship starts and ends. You know, it's about having a map or guidelines.
Yeah.
There is a very good little summary I've got on a slide, what have boundaries got to do with relationships, and it's all about a balancing act, and that is where the author of that called it a balancing act. And it says, we all know when our personal boundaries have been crossed, we feel put down, taken advantage of, angry, resentful, etc. The worst offenders are the ones who are closest to us, friends and family, although sometimes virtual strangers can cross the line too. So what constitutes crossing the line? Anything that makes you feel uncomfortable and is usually a result of not standing up for yourself. How do you get others to respect your personal boundaries? So this is, I think it's just a very good summary. So how do you get people to respect your personal boundaries? And if you don't show respect, and we know this even as Christians, if I don't show respect, I'm not going to get it back. So I can't expect people to respect me and respect my boundaries if I'm not being respectful. So where does the boundary start? I believe it starts with each one of us.
That's true. I feel sometimes that it's good to have that friend or relative that will point out that maybe you don't have such healthy ways of communicating. But let's say, I guess first step is to realize we've got that issue, right? And then where do we go from there? How do we change the way we treat each other, or how we set boundaries?
Okay, which is a good question. It's getting the right information, which is why I've ended up doing these sorts of programs, because like I said, people don't always learn about it. All they know is my relationships aren't working, they're not healthy, whether it be family, personal, and often in a family pattern that isn't working well and the boundaries are violated, we usually go on and attracted to and pick people in our life, whether it be friends or another relationship that is the same pattern, because it's all we know. It's an uncomfortable comfort zone. It's like, what do I know? I only know how to do it this way. And then you attract the same, or you're attracted to what you're comfortable with, even though it's not good for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's subconscious, is it? Because I find I've done the same thing. One time I said to my husband, I said, I think I picked a husband just like my mum. How did that happen?
How did he relate to that? They're going, oh. And then
he doesn't mind, yeah.
And he's picked you or attracted to you. We're attracted to what we know, not what we don't know, unless if we consciously know what we don't want in relationships anymore, then we're going to look at it differently. And that's how we learn. But how do I know what I want when I've done it this way my whole life and it's not working? So this is where learning some skills and starting to put them into place versus expecting others to change, we need to do the changing. We can never change another person, we can only change ourselves. But if you change, they change, because they've got someone different to deal with. The way you do it changes. And people aren't always comfortable with that. And I find that in the work I do, that sometimes I get people who don't like the changes. They've wanted maybe the husband or the wife or even children to come and see me because they want them to change. But when they change, which means they have to change, I don't like it, because they don't see themselves as a problem. They only see the other person as the problem.
Yeah. So how do we go about that? How do we, I guess, what are the steps of setting healthy boundaries?
Okay. Well, I guess one of the things I've looked at, there's another slide I had here, the best way to deal with our defences, because to set healthy boundaries, we have to start to become aware of ourselves, and our defence mechanisms are the problem. And we see others' defences, but we don't realise we have our own. And we did do a session, I think it was at the last one, I think, on defence mechanisms, I'm pretty sure. But with our defences, because we set boundaries to protect ourselves and others, and this is on the slide that will be up there. Boundaries are about how we deal with other people's defence mechanisms, and we need to set boundaries with ourselves before we can set it with others. So we often look at the other person, think, oh, they're rude, or they're angry, or why do they treat me like that? Or they become defensive, but we can't see our defences. So this is why looking at the information that we've given, you can find plenty of it online, but you have to start looking at, how do I protect myself? Is it healthy or unhealthy? And as much as I'd like to see myself as a healthy person, I know I've not had some good defences. Like knowing too much to make yourself look good isn't a good defence, because people can't compete, and they end up giving up or walking away because you know too much. And then there's no communication. Communication shut down, like the non-verbals, giving people that glare or that look, things like that we learn that's within probably the family that we automatically do. But you can ask people. Sometimes I've asked, or people have given me feedback. Instead of ignoring it, I go, well, that's what they're saying. I need to take a look at that. So sometimes it's a bit hard to eat humble pie. But sometimes we have to and go, well, I'm not always a very nice person. What do I do that I need to change? And if you don't know, ask someone. And if you're married, or you've got children, or you ask family, friends, particularly when you have altercations with people, say, what am I doing then that's upsetting you? Instead of, you're upsetting me. See, that's the sort of thing we can look at. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
But we can have a look, and I'll put that on this slide, what happens in a relationship when we have either healthy or unhealthy boundaries. And there are different types of boundaries, and this is the source of this is in a book by a lady by the name of Pia Melody, in Facing Codependence, and she outlined this very, very well. So the first one that I've got up there, this is damaged boundary system, and it's got the person, and I'm not gender specific. It can be male, female, it can be anyone, I should say. Now, what happens when we don't have good boundaries, and we sometimes let people in the door, and then we sometimes slam the door in their face, that's what the broken line is. Partial awareness, we're not aware we're always doing it, and partial protection. Like sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I get it badly wrong, and then I get violated. Does that make sense? So control and negotiation of distance and touch with some people some of the time. Because you have a look, what are boundaries? Distance, like with the fence, we talked about that fence around the house. Well, we can have that fence a long way away, or we can have it very close to the house. And it's same with us. What's our distance? And when we don't know someone, the boundary distance is much greater than when we meet up with a friend who we're going to give a hug to, or touch, or do something to or with. So this is where we look at relationships vary in that boundary system. But when it's damaged, you're going to have someone you don't need to let into your life, and because they're going to hurt you, and yet you let them in the door. And then other times you don't. You see, so this is where that we need to have not partial awareness, but full awareness of who that person is, what's an appropriate distance. And have you ever met someone who you don't know them? First time you meet them, they want to give you a big hug, and they're just so friendly. It's like, no, I don't know you. It's really awkward, but they don't have good boundaries. And what they do is their boundary system is, no, I want to be loved and, connected. So here, give me a hug. And it's not always comfortable. So this is where we've got to learn to read people and what's appropriate. How well do we know them? Is it appropriate to touch, or is it that's something we do further down the track when we get to know each other more. You see, those are sorts of decisions. So, yeah. The next one is this slide looks at a non-existent boundary system. So have you ever felt totally unprotected? There's no awareness, can't control anything or negotiate distance or touch. And they're the sort of people that are incredibly vulnerable to predators because they don't have a boundary system. Often that system is violated to that degree with someone who's being very abused as a child and where boundaries were non-existent, and they haven't learnt boundaries, and they don't know how to protect themselves, so they have no protection. So this is where that person will be picked up by someone who wants to control you or control something in your life. Okay, so both of those are not good boundaries. The next slide looks at walls instead of boundaries. If you had someone who you just can't connect to or get close to, that they just shut you out. Okay, and you can see here we get walls. So that means that when we talk about that house and that fence, you can do a brick wall without a gate in it or lock the gate and let nobody in. And these are things that happen. Anger is one of them. How much do we like being with angry people? It's not comfortable. And so often we don't. And yet the best way, and this is where communication comes into it, is identify, recognize, and go, oh, I can see you're angry. And that immediately puts in the appropriate boundary, but we don't. We actually usually run and hide from angry people, particularly if we've had a lot of anger in our past. The other one is fear. So if I'm very fearful and terrified, particularly of other people, we can go into phobias here, we can, because of fear, we put up a wall. And we can put up a mask. A mask can be that wall. And the other one is using words. Using your intellect, for example, creates a wall. You can't get close to the person. Walls stop you from getting close and connecting. And the other one is silence. People don't say anything or give you the silent treatment. That's a big wall that you can't penetrate. So people who are usually very, very damaged will put in these walls. And it's either complete protection, where they're just totally protected and they won't let anyone in, but there's no intimacy. They can't connect. I've met, in the work I do over the years, I've met particularly, this is with the several males I've had, who present as the biker and the leathers and the tough, tattoos and the hair and all this sort of thing, what they wear. And yet underneath they are such caring, sensitive people, but they've been so hurt and they quite willingly admit that they have the bike and the leathers and all of that because it keeps people away. People don't want to connect to them. It protects them. So this is where, yet what do we go? Oh, they're scary people. And look, there are bikies who are scary people and are really angry, aggressive, nasty people. I'm not saying that. But generally, the biker, the person who has a bike and dresses up like that, can be a way of protecting. So this comes back to how do I control? How can I have rigid control over a situation? A few sharp words will send people scurrying, for example. And there's no negotiation of distance. You just don't come near me, basically, or touch me. Okay, and I don't know if you've met people like that, but often they isolate, so we don't always get to meet them. Okay.
You mentioned an interesting point as well, Jenifer, about if we have been abused as a child, we tend to choose someone maybe that is controlling, and then maybe the abuse continues, and that is the absence of the boundaries from what you said. And that was really interesting to me, because sometimes I watch documentaries or listen to testimonies of women that will say that they went from one abusive relationship to another to the next one, and you wonder how that happens, why they can't pick up on that, if they don't see any red flags and all of that. So I guess now you're explaining it's sometimes the absence of the boundaries that have never been learned.
Well, they haven't, but when you've been brought up in an abusive family, and often the abuser will say they love you, and you think abuse equals love, and often you pick, and I've had a number of women say, oh, he must love me or he wouldn't hit me, which is a terrible thing. But that's because her perception, the boundaries at home were so awful and they were confused then with love. Even, I wouldn't hit you if I didn't love you principle. So as a child. So this is where we learn these processes and we get very confused, and then we're attracted to the same thing because that's what we know. It's an uncomfortable comfort zone because that's what we know. Yeah,
that's all we know.
So it's first of all, it's recognizing what boundaries you have or don't have, right? So we've sort of outlined a couple of, just a few or three of them that can happen. None, totally rigid, or let people in and shut them out, all over the place. So this is where looking at, what are my boundaries like? What do I do? Do I do those things? Do I sometimes get it right? Do I sometimes get it wrong? Or do I get it awfully wrong? So each person listening needs to look at their boundaries, and it's back to quality of that relationship. If you are picking the wrong relationships, and look, it's not just looking for a relationship with a partner or to marry, it's also looking at friendships, people we connect to, how we connect with children. So it's multifaceted, this sort of thing. But we have to step back and look at, and things like who's in control. This is one of the things I did because I was brought up with control. You control the situation and then you won't get hurt, but that's not true. You control the situation, you'll be a very lonely person because people don't want to know you. So you have to learn not to control. But one of my questions to me is, who's in control? And this is where, as a Christian now and coming to Christ, I let Christ in the door 24/7 because he is the only one I can trust. Okay, but I've learned a lot by doing that. So I've had to learn healthy boundaries because I do have someone now I can trust in my life. But it's also, if I let God take control of my life or I in control? They're the only two questions we can ask. So who's in control? If God isn't in control, and not in that God's not a control fit. Control is that he loves us, he wants the best for us, he gives us opportunities, and we can feel connected and loved in that relationship. But as far as control goes, the world wants to control you. Governments do, people do, work environments do. So this is where, if there's people controlling within the relationship or trying to control, and it's usually in very unhealthy ways, not in an open and honest way, then you're going the wrong way. And having a look at, okay, who's in control? Do I let others control me, or do I control them, or do I switch and change? Right? Ask yourself some questions.
Yes.
It's a good way to go. Okay, so let's have a look at what's an intact boundary system. And this was a very good, I thought, representation where an intact boundary system, and this is for everyone, it's not for, for all people, doesn't matter what age, is where you've got protection, which is, instead of a square, it's now got rounded edges, right? So what it does, you've got control, protection, and vulnerability within that space, but you can be flexible and you have appropriate control, and you can negotiate distance and touch. Okay, so this means it's having that self-control in a healthy way where you can set the boundary, know the limits for you and for other people. Because sometimes people want you to do things that will violate their own limits. And that's what you have to then point out. Children are classics. And we have to go, no. And mums and dad are doing well and they're working together, the kids know, then you will be flexible, but you will have control in that situation. And that's where communication comes in, explaining why they're not allowed to do that. And it's in whether it's adults or whatever, talking, communicating, and say, why? No, if you do that, this is the impact it has on me. Or if you do that, then I might react that way. We talk about it and bring it out into the open. But if you don't feel safe with that person, you can't do it. But if you're a healthy, intact boundary system, you'll express it. You'll let that person know, well, look, what's happening now, it can affect me. So have a think about it, or whatever we communicate, and we can talk about it later on, and then both parties can go and have a look and come back. This is about putting in a healthy boundary system, okay, that is negotiable when it needs to be.
So you're talking about intact boundary system, Jenifer. How do we have that intact boundary system to set healthy boundaries then?
Okay. Well, this is really the focus what we want to look at, and I've put together a set. We'll look at each slide. There are 3 main steps, but there's also a 4th one if it's not working, because unfortunately with our defences we're very good at destroying boundary systems or avoiding them if people try and set boundaries. So we can talk about the different degrees, and you might have some examples we can discuss. But on the first slide we're looking at, which is step 1, is identifying the problem. So if it's looking at the person to go, what is the problem here? What are they doing that is, we often say, pressing my button, or not listening to me, or whatever. What is it they're doing? Because if we're defensive, we're going to attack the person. You know, things like, oh, you always do that, and I'm really sick of it, and you're a horrible person, and we often do it to children too. So instead of, we mustn't attack the person. To set a healthy boundary, we attack the behaviour. And if they take it personally, say, no, I'm pointing out what you're doing. I'm not attacking you, but this is where we learn. So you've got to start somewhere. And when you've been doing it for quite a while, you find ways to go that next step. But initially, it's just learning how to set up the behaviour. What have they done that is bothering me? Now, a very good way of doing that is what we call face saving. In other words, do it as a bit of a question, or you're pointing out something. They'll go, oh, no, I hadn't noticed. Because sometimes people, they might know they're doing it, and some people deliberately do things to get your attention, and they know they're doing it. But if you do face saving, they don't get as defensive. So I've been sprung, but I'm not going to tell her that or him that, you see. This is the sort of thing. So I put in several there, but you can think of others. It's like, have you noticed? Have you noticed that, like, leaving your wet towels on the floor all the time? If you notice that you do that, or if you notice you don't close the door when you come inside, or I have noticed that, so you're now making the observation. Or do you realise, right? Are you aware? So we're asking it as a question or pointing it out as an observation, and it's about the behaviour, not about the person. So when you do that, it gives the person the opportunity to say, oh, no, I didn't realise. Oh, yeah, I know I do that, you know, but I'm not aware of doing it at the time. So it might start a dialogue other than the person becoming very defensive, which is, yeah, you're having a go at me. Well, no, I'm just noticing that this is what's going on. I'm not attacking you, you know. So depending on how they respond, this is where it's not totally predictable. The firmest boundary is the when you. And sometimes, particularly with children, we might have to do that, because children are very good at learning to press the button, push the limits, get around you somehow to get their needs met. Kids are very self-focused. I want, and I want to get it. You watch them in supermarkets or when you're at home or whatever, even at school. So it's when you, which is a much stronger statement to get attention. So, but it's not something you would start with. You try the more, what we call that face-saving approach initially, where you can actually identify the problem. And you might have to probe a little bit more. If they say, well, I haven't noticed, I'll say, well, look, you don't seem to be aware of it. So is it okay if I point it out to you when you do it again? All right. So you're then getting permission to keep working with it. So it comes back to how sensitive, the person is. So does that all make sense?
Because, I guess when you is more of a statement that follows that, right? It's not really a question. It doesn't really give them the chance, or there's no window of maybe that's not the case. You're making a statement that is the case, and it upsets me.
Yeah. But I find it works well when you do it as a more gentle way of saying, and like, do you realise that when you're watching TV and switching channels all the time, I find that a bit stressful. Do you realise that? Because there might be a channel changer in your family. Men like to flick through things. Some women do, but But if you do it as a question, because they're not aware, they're just doing it.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
yeah, it's trying to set a boundary, but sometimes just by asking a question like that or pointing it out can set the boundary. And, oh, yeah, I do that. I won't do that. You let me know if you like something and we'll stay on the program, or if it's channel changing, for example. So some people are quite willing to take that on board. Others are resistant. So this is where, when you are setting a boundary, it is a skill. Unless the person is willing to work with you and says, yes, you're right, I work at changing it, and yes, I'd like your help and support, which is usually rare. Most people ignore it. Oh, she'll forget about it after a while, or he won't bother. So we have these terms we use. So we've got to keep at it. And sometimes we have to go that next level, and we might have to point the behaviour out more than once. And we're going to look eventually, after we do these steps, look at what happens if people regress or don't follow the boundary or ignoring it. What can we do? And looking at consequences. But is there anything else you would like to ask about, or you're aware of about behaviours, or identifying the problem or what they did? Anything else you can think of, or you think that's...
I was just thinking about, as you were talking, I was just thinking about how there was a parent just recently that said to the child, oh, you're a whinger. And I was trying to talk to them and say, whinger basically sends a message to the child that that's the type of person they are. It's a very general statement about who the child is. But if you say you're whinging, it's more about the behavior at the time that it's happening. So it doesn't send them the message that, oh, I'm a whinger, and the child actually learns that that's just how they are. So
yeah, well, a whinger means that's a label. That is identifying them as that person. That means we just attack them, right? We've put the label on. Whereas if you say you're whinging, now, as long as the child knows whinging means complaining and carrying on, which kids are good at doing when they want something, and not all, but some are. So, so it comes back to making sure the child understands the language. Depends on how old they are or whether they know what that term means. So, and if not, if they look at you blank, we say, do you understand what I mean by, we explore it, by whinging? And they might not know. So then you explain to them, or even I find sometimes saying back to the person, this is what you just said to me. And they go, oh, yeah.
They haven't realised.
Yes, yeah. Because we don't. We hear it coming out of our mouth, but when we hear it back, we go, oh, yeah, I can see why you think that. Right? So sometimes it's good to give that feedback, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So, so there are the three parts to setting the initial boundary do not have to be in order, but I find for you to even consider any of the other steps, we need to know what the person's doing. We need to identify that behaviour, because the second step is how it affects you. Now, not everyone might want to hear this or need to hear it. And because a lot of people don't like the I feel, or it upsets me, but you can find other ways of doing it. I react in an angry way when you say it like that is different from saying I'm really angry with you, or whatever, you see. So it's pointing out how it affects you. This is how I react when you're angry with me. So it's how it affects me. But not everyone wants to hear it, and we don't always have to. I find often things like I get so frustrated. I've asked you several times to please go and do that, and you still haven't done it. Like adults and children do that. So it's okay to say I'm getting frustrated is a low level of anger. I'm getting really frustrated. Why? And then you're going back to the behaviour. Why won't you do that? I've asked you to do that. What stops you? So you then explore the behaviour a bit more. You're now communicating, you're now interacting with that person. Sometimes, I don't know, sometimes you get that. Say, well, I think it might be because we can give our opinion then, because sometimes people don't, it's autopilot. Like, do you do it automatically? Because sometimes they do. That's what they do. Mum says that, I do this if it's a child. Or Dad does that, and I do that. So this is where we then have to get them to think about it. Asking questions gets people to think. So I think that's often very healthy for doing boundaries. But it is okay when it's appropriate to let the person know how it affects you, right? Because if it's stressful for you, then they need to know that and need to know why. Not doing things like, you are causing me to be stressed or you are causing me to be angry. No, it's a choice. We have choices. Why do some people not to and some choose to?
Yeah, and that's what I was about to say as well. You are right. Some people, and I think the majority of people, don't want to be responsible for your emotions. When you tell them something they've done makes you upset, then the defensive, you can expect that defensive reaction that, oh no, it's your choice, you're upset because you're sensitive or something like that.
Yeah. So it's identifying that, but it's being willing to engage that interaction with the person to be able to resolve it. This is like resolving conflict, basically. Okay, so the third step is to find a solution. What would you prefer? Say what you would prefer or like. What are your true needs here? You know, I'd really appreciate if you did this. I would prefer it this way. It'd be better if, I'd like you to. So it's then putting in the solution to the problem. And you might start, well, would you realise in you doing that all the time becomes a problem, particularly not just for me, but maybe for other people around you or whatever, but certainly that it has become a problem for me. And I'd really appreciate, or I'd prefer it if, or I'd like you to, does that make sense? Right. And I've got on here in this slide, take into account the other person's true needs as well as your own. This is a two-way street. So what are the other person's true needs as well? Are they same as you? Is there room for negotiation or some sort of compromise? I mean, some things cannot be compromised, but there's sometimes you can work it out together and say, well, how about we do this then instead of the half hour, like maybe we can do it for 10 minutes, so there is room to compromise, if that makes sense. Okay. Yeah. Now, sometimes when you're setting a boundary, you could actually start with what you would like them to do, right? Or you can start because you're pointing out the behaviour, because I prefer it if you close the door when you come in because all the flies come in otherwise. Or have you noticed that the flies are coming in when you leave the door open? And here I know I live in Fly City, I think sometimes they've got plenty. But it's, yeah. So you can see how there are ways to do things that you can actually use these three dynamics. So it's what the person's doing, the behaviour, how it's affecting you, and what would you like them to do? What would you prefer? So once you work that out, you can know how to verbalise the boundary.
That's very good. And sometimes I find as well that if I know that there are people that can get defensive, I just tell them how I feel, and then I tell them, hey, you don't need to answer, or you don't need to come up with explanations, or tell me how I didn't notice it correctly or whatever. Just think about it. And if you think that I have a point, maybe try to change it. If not, then just don't worry about it. I don't need an answer from you right now.
Yeah. Well, that's it. But there are certain boundaries we need to put in place. It's not good enough to say, well, it doesn't matter. At least you thought about it, because it's still going to be a problem. Unless you don't know the person well or you work with them and it doesn't matter. So it just depends. Depends on the environment, situation, and who we're setting boundaries with. But this works in every situation. And it's showing respect. We need to be respectful. And if we don't show respect by pointing the problem out in the right way, then it is that they're not going to respect you back. And that includes children. Children I've often worked with, or I've dealt with, they don't respect adults. They see them as hypocrites. They tell me what to do, but they don't do it, sort of thing. So to set a boundary, we have to be consistent in what we do and the way we do it.
That's true. Yeah, just thinking about kids, I guess I was talking to April, and I said, well, if you don't do this, there's going to be consequences. And she was saying, Mummy, what are consequences? I had to explain to her.
Okay, so once you explained that, she was okay? You explain what a
Yes.
consequence was. Mm.
Yeah, she was okay. And then I find that she uses that on her younger brother to tell him that there will be consequences. So I have to be very careful with what I teach her because she's going to implement it on the younger brother.
You can see where we learn either rigid boundaries, no boundaries, appropriate boundaries, going back to our upbringing and how the parent doesn't just verbalize it, but demonstrates it in her own life and relationships. So this is where
Yes.
the model, yeah, well, this is what happens. The fourth step is if you do these 3 steps and you're being ignored, they're violating the boundaries still because they think it doesn't matter and they've got away with it for so long. So what you say isn't going to make any difference. Or they are purely the type of people who just want to have control, and it doesn't matter how well you set the boundary, they're going to go on to that next level. They're going to, because what boundaries are doing that I think is helpful for people to know is it exposes the games people are playing. People play games, okay? And the problem is, unless you know what the game is, you keep getting caught up in it. People can know they're playing a game. In my marriage, my husband was very good at, he liked to press buttons, see how far he could go to get away with something or to get a reaction. I was not aware this was his game because I don't do that. And it took me a long, long time and it wasn't until I said, why do you keep doing things that you know I'm going to react? And a big smile. Oh, that's because I like to see how far I can go before you react. So once
he was aware of it.
he was tongue in cheek. He was aware of it. He wasn't doing it to be nasty and horrible. It was the game that he and that's what he learned to do in his upbringing and survival in life as he grew up. So once I knew that, it'd start, I go, I know what you're doing. You're just trying to press my button. That was, and I could then set the boundary, and we could do it with humour, tongue in cheek. Humour is a great way to do things, to set boundaries. And that meant I realised what was going on now because now I knew the rules of the game. But once you expose the game, then you now, the person who has the rule, if they don't like it, oh, they know what I'm onto. Like mum knows what I'm onto now. Kids are good at that. So they have to go the next level of changing the game and making it difficult again. Does that make sense? So they then, change the rules or up the ante, as they say. And what we say here is go that next level of making it really difficult. So then you've got to expose the next game and the next game. But then there's a point you've got to go, I'm sick of all the games you play, and we seem to get somewhere and then you keep doing something else. So where are we headed? And that takes skill, right? People have to be comfortable with setting boundaries, have to recognize it and be willing to go that next step. If you are with someone who's very abusive and they don't want to let go of their abuse, sometimes you have no other choice to leave, whether it be a friend, marriage, family. Sometimes you have to walk away because you've tried everything you can in a healthy way and you want to respect yourself as well as others. So sometimes you have to take time out. Sometimes if it's a marriage, you might separate for a while to go back, to learn skills, to do things and get some counselling to help you to sort it out. So there's all sorts of things. It doesn't mean it has to be permanent, but in some cases, relationships are so abusive that you can only walk away. That person isn't going to change. And if you try and set a boundary, they up the abuse.
I'm looking back and I'm just thinking about different relationships as you talk. I'm thinking about friendships that I had in the past that I was thinking, if I had that friend now, I probably wouldn't be able to get along because I did not realize then that they were controlling me. They had to be the first one. They had to always be one step ahead of me and above me and all of that. And now I'm thinking, how did I not realize that? But I think I went through that point in my life where I had those types of friends, and then also there was a point where I retaliated, and then I would be very careful in choosing friends. So I guess to find that healthy balance, as you were mentioning as well.
Absolutely. But the word you've used, which is the issue for all relationships, is control. Who's in control?
Mm.
Are you in control? Are they in control? And if we look at the control factors and you can identify who's controlling whom, then you know what boundary you need to set, because that's the game. You've got to expose that control. But you have to make sure you're not the one controlling.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's that power triangle we talked about, where you have the perpetrator and the victim and the person who is the rescuer.
Yes,
so nobody's
yes,
got control. We're all trying to control each other or being controlled. So this is where we have to relinquish control and learn to respect and be honest in any relationship. And that takes skill and time and often healing. If we've been wounded emotionally, we need to do that. I think one of the things as we've been talking, and this is where I've got another slide here, is what if all else fails? And this is like, you've done all you can do. What if all else fails? And I've put in 3 steps. If these 3 steps don't work and there's no behaviour change, you've got to set realistic and fair consequences. So consequences, which we have talked about, is the issue. And you talked about that with your daughter. So to set a consequence with her, if she breaks it, then you've got to make the consequence firmer for her. It's the same with other adults. And it's to the point, for example, with an adult who talks over you all the time, and you ask them not to, and they pull back, and then they're just talking all over you again, or they won't stop. What's a consequence? A consequence might be, when you're doing that, I'll be going and leaving the room because I've asked you not to do that. You keep talking over the top of me and we can't communicate. So then I'm going to leave the room. So then you can talk to yourself, basically. Yeah. So there's all sorts of names, and I get other people say, oh, well, then they're going to follow me, and you might have to take time out and get out of the place for a while to break that pattern, or ask them not to do that. And this is where counselling can help, finding out, well, why do we do this to each other? Why? Often we're feeling insecure, we're feeling hurt, we can be the dog with the bone, we can be too persistent, if that makes sense. So the other one is, setting realistic and fair consequences. Never set a consequence you won't carry out or can't carry through. So if you set an extreme consequence and you can't follow it, then that's it. That person knows that doesn't matter what consequence you set, you can't follow it. You can't fulfill it. So we have to make it fair, reasonable, but we know we can carry it through. And we sometimes do that with children, and then we can't fulfill it. Or we set a consequence that we don't want to be part of. Remember when with my nephew, it was a thing of setting a consequence was, well, if you don't do what you're meant to do, we won't go to the beach. We all wanted to go to the beach. So then he kept messing up. And so guess what? None of us went to the beach. And we all wanted to go. So you see how that was not a good consequence. Yeah. So we're setting something we don't want to do, and then we're the ones wearing it as well.
We're punished.
We're punishing ourselves. So it's having a look. If I set that consequence, what's the consequence for me, I guess? How's that going to play out? And the other point here, setting healthy boundaries with love and respect. And if it was you, how would you like to be spoken to?
That's a good one.
Yeah. So, and I find as a Christian, I think, well, how would Jesus speak to me if that was me? What would he say? Or we can have a look in the Bible and see how he set boundaries. And he was always fair. He did it with love. He did it firmly at times. So we can learn a lot from that as a model. Okay.
And I guess the Bible does refer to us as little children.
Yes.
Sometimes we read in the Bible little children, and then instructions follow.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we're still little children, aren't we, really? And we need to have that innocence and that reality of children, but do it with maturity, if that makes sense. We can still be childlike in that, because children are so delightful, and they love and they trust, and But as an adult, we have to see if someone is trustworthy, and if not, we have to set the boundary if they break trust.
Yeah, that is true. And I try to teach April as well. And just yesterday, I was part of a health expo, and we had a massage table, we had a table for nutrition and all of that. And I was just the people that would come through to all the different stalls. I would try to tell them, is it okay if we do this procedure? You can say no. You have to sometimes tell them you can say no, because you can see sometimes they sit down, they're like, okay, but they're not comfortable.
No.
So then, yeah, you can tell, I guess, who is more firm in saying, no, thank you, I don't want that procedure, or who will be just sitting down there, but you can tell they would rather not be there. So
yes,
it's
and
okay to say no.
Yeah, it's you being aware of the non-verbals and the communication, and as a practitioner that, you know, and anyone, even a friend, if you're pushing your friend to do something and they're not comfortable, you have to pull back and say, oh, I can see you're not comfortable.
Yeah.
Would you like to do it differently or something else, or is there a problem? You know, we can then explore it. That's where communication comes into it. So whether it be children to adults, we need to do that.
That's very good.